Hey everybody, thank you for joining us for our webinar this morning. My name is Brad Vorbeck. I'm with Turnkey Technologies, and we also have Nick Wong with SAP Concur with us. And he's going to be taking us through the importance of simplifying the capture of travel and expense costs as your organization scales up and expands. So I just want to give a quick little intro about Turnkey for anybody who isn't familiar, and then I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Nick. Turnkey is a business solutions provider. We're based in St. Louis, Missouri, and we're primarily focused on Microsoft solutions for finance and operations, customer engagement, as well as Office 365, Power BI, managed IT services, and cloud hosting. And we've been partnering Concur with for years to provide integration and extensions to our Dynamics ERP solutions that automate expense management. And our customers have had lots of success using Concur, so we're happy to join them today and have this webinar with them. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to ask them on your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll do our best at the end to get everything answered in a Q&A session. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be on our website and YouTube channel in about 3 to 5 business days. And so I just want to thank everybody again for joining us this morning. And Nick, do you want to go ahead and take it away?
Great. Thank you very much, Brad. All right. So before we get started, just a little bit of introduction to what SAP Concur has to offer. When you think about your company's spending, you can really put it into 3 different buckets. Of course, you have your payroll, which makes up about 35% because you can't have a company without people. But then about 10% of your spend is your travel and expense items, and then you have the 55%, which is everything else, which is the accounts payable side of things. Now, SAP Concur does have the ability to handle the other 65% outside of payroll, as you can see here. But for today's conversation, we're really just going to be focusing on the travel and expense side of things. The reason that we exist is that there's a better way to do things. When you think about something as simple as the bank, and back in the day, we used to all go to the bank to deposit our checks, to do pretty much every single interaction. Now I bet a lot of you on the call can't even remember the last time that you even set foot in a bank, especially to do something simple like deposit a check. And the reason why that's the case is you now have mobile apps. So mobile functionality to go ahead, deposit checks. You can even apply for loans on your mobile app as well. The same is true with expense reports. Gone are the days of spreadsheets, or worse yet, paper copies of expense reports and paper receipts. And now you can do all of that from the convenience of your mobile device. So does any of this sound familiar? Things like employees are spending far too much time filling out and tracking expenses. Your finance team is buried in spreadsheets and paper receipts. Expense reports are often late, missing receipts or missing details. And of course, the ever popular travel or expense policies aren't being followed. I'm sure all of you on the call love being the bad guy and telling your top salesperson that you're not going to reimburse them on their full expense report because they didn't follow policy. So we found that our biggest competitor is actually no action, because a lot of our prospects think that their current process is free because paper is relatively inexpensive and everybody has Excel on their computers. But the reality, when you take into account all the things we just covered on the previous slide, missing receipts, missed policies, the cost to handling an expense report in a manual-based process is around $20.65. This is a study done by a third-party company, the Aberdeen Expense Management Group. So what could you be doing with more time and more resources if you're not devoting so much of those to expense reports? Well, first off, you could increase revenue growth. Every hour that your revenue-driving sales force is not spending filling out an expense report is an hour that they could be out making sales. Of course, you could improve your operational efficiency so that as your head count of people incurring expenses starts to grow, you wouldn't have to necessarily add in back-end headcount to compensate, because you'll have a solution like SAP Concur that can scale up with you. You'll have time to develop new products and services. Attracting and retaining talent, while fourth on this list, is the quickest riser of the bunch. And that nowadays, with all the millennials coming out of college, I remember when I was in college and I was in the minority to have a laptop and to take notes on. Nowadays, if you were to go into a classroom, you couldn't find a single person who's still writing on paper. The last thing that somebody who spent 4, 6, or maybe 8 years earning their degree wants to do coming out of college is to go back to a paper-based process. And then, of course, lastly, entering new channels and markets for distribution. So what we're going to show you today is a platform that benefits all stakeholders. Because yes, while we've been talking about making the employees' lives easier to capture expenses on the go, to save time, and to get paid faster, we want to make sure that it's going to benefit even the back end as well. Because there's no point to doing this if we're just going to trade one headache for another. Managers are going to have better visibility into their spend because they don't need to wait for the month-end reports that AP is giving them with the data entered into your ERP system. Instead, they're able to pull reports directly within SAP Concur to analyze their spend as soon as that expense has been added to an expense report. Accounting will be able to save time because they're no longer the ones having to go through every single line item of the report to identify policy violations. That will also, of course, eliminate potential human errors to increase compliance, and it'll also increase control without them having to be the bad guy because our system's going to catch it for you. And then lastly, for our executive leaderships in the room, visibility into your spend. You'll have dashboards that combine multiple reports into a single view to make it easy for you to identify trends in your spending. We also talked about having the peace of mind that you'll have a solution in place that can scale and grow with you. A little bit about our company. SAP Concur has been around since 1993. In that time, we've amassed over 40,000 clients worldwide. 25,000 of those are specifically in the small and medium-sized businesses here in North America. We pride ourselves on a very high client satisfaction rate, and we'll show you a screenshot of our recent reviews within the iTunes App Center. And we also put a huge focus on research and development. Of course, that was already something that we prided ourselves on, but with the acquisition by SAP, we have now even more resources to constantly push the envelope when it comes to innovations within our platform. It's also important to note that we take your security very seriously. We understand that you would have a lot of sensitive data within SAP Concur on both the expense report side as well as the invoice side if you were to take advantage of that in the future. Here's a list of some of the many audits that we perform, both internal and external, to make sure that we are up to compliance. A little fun fact is that the IRS is one of our clients, and while people might have mixed feelings about how they feel on the IRS, I think we can all universally agree that they have very, very high standards when it comes to security and protection. So as we mentioned before, we are one platform for all of your outgoing cash besides payroll. Of course, we have the invoice platform, but we're going to focus today on travel and expense. By having all of this in a cloud-based platform, it makes it very easy for you to have seamless integration with various ERP systems like the Dynamics suite. It also allows you to have total visibility wherever you are in the world. So we're going to walk you through this journey primarily from 3 different individuals of Brad, Maggie, and Anna. They are our traveler/expense filer, our approving manager, as well as our AP specialist. Typically, your AP specialist will also be the one to administrate your SAP Concur account. All 3 of them are going to use the exact same platform, which means that they don't have to worry about multiple logins of this, switch between submitting, approving expense reports, and invoices. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Brad. We do have a couple of poll questions that we would like to present to you just to get a feel of the room of what we've got here.
You guys should be seeing the first poll question now, 1 of 3. Do you see that on your end, Nick?
Yes, I do.
Okay. We'll give about 10 seconds for everybody to answer this one. Okay, looks like we got all our answers in here. So did you want to go ahead and share those results of that question, Nick?
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Okay, great. So it looks like we do have travelers here in the audience, so that's perfect. All right.
Okay, question 2 of 3 is coming up here. How does your company currently process expense reports? All right, looks like we got our responses.
Okay. All right, so glad to see that nobody's just handing them into APA financing as well. Probably that's the easiest for your travelers. That is the bar none the worst method for our folks on the call. So glad to hear nobody has that headache.
All right, and finally the third question. How many expense reports do you process monthly? Pretty even spread on that one.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Brad.
No problem.
Okay, so starting first with the travel booking tool, Brad is going to take center stage. We'll show you what it looks like to book a flight, car, and hotel within your SAP Concur environment. We'll also talk about the e-receipts that Brad will receive for his airfare, car rental, and hotel charges. And we'll talk about duty of care as of course. It's very unfortunate, but now more than ever, that is a very important thing to keep track of your employee safety. So when Brad logs into his SAP Concur account, he will have the travel booking tool over here to the left-hand side. And if he's ever booked online before, he'll feel right at home, where he plugs in his to and from addresses, his dates of travel, indicate if he'd like to have a rental car or not, and then lastly, a hotel or not. The e-receipts that he'll receive are digital copies of each of his transactions. We have 100% commercial airline participation. The majority of car rental companies are on board, as well as rideshare companies such as Lyft and Uber. And you can also see to the right, we have the lion's share of hotels that produce e-receipts as well. These are IRS compliant, so that's one less thing for your traveler to worry about. Now, when Brad goes to select his flight, he'll be able to see a matrix of the available options, and in that yellow, you can see the first indication of your policy being brought into our system. Now, the actual pricing and the fulfillment of the ticket is provided by a travel management company of your choosing. We understand that when you first hear the words travel management company or travel agency, the initial thought is that's a lot of money for each booking. And while yes, if you were to directly call into a travel management company, it's typically between $26 to $45, even $60 per booking. When you're utilizing a tool like SAP Concur, you only have to typically pay about $5 per booking, which is really the same thing that Expedia is charging you in the back end, and even what Delta is charging you in the back end to book directly on their sites. Meanwhile, you do have the power of a travel management company behind your system to help you keep track of canceled and unused tickets, also help your employees get from their destination, from one location to another in the event of a cancellation flight on the airline's part. Now here we can see 3 flights of varying degrees of compliance. The Delta Airlines at the top is in policy, the Alaska in the middle is slightly out of policy, and the Alaska down at the bottom is drastically out of policy. Now during implementation, your company would be able to decide just how strict or how loose you want these guidelines to be. If I were to select the Delta flight, I could go ahead with my purchase, no additional steps. If Brad were to select this Alaska that's slightly out of policy, he gets prompted with the violation that he's breaking. You can see here that we're using percentages to identify this violations, because if we just set, say, a $500 amount, that could only get Brad from Seattle to New York in coach, but meanwhile, he could fly first class with $500 down to LA. Brad will be required to select an explanation from the dropdown as to why he booked out of policy, and he will most likely want to fill in a custom explanation as well, because his manager, Maggie, is going to get an email notification letting her know that Brad booked outside of policy. She'll be able to see what fare he selected and what others were available. Now, if Brad were to book drastically out of policy, this, again, he'll get prompted with the violations. He'll be required to fill in an explanation. But now, instead of just an email notification, Maggie is required to make an approval. She'll have just under 24 hours, which is in line with the airline cancellation policies, and she can do this either on the web interface, as we see to the left, or on the mobile app, as we see to the right. And in those yellow boxes, we can see the comments that Brad left behind as to why he wants to select that flight that's out of policy. Now, your company is able to decide what that 24-hour time limit means, whether Maggie has 24 hours to approve the flight, otherwise it gets automatically canceled, thereby saving your company a lot of front-end costs of outrageous charges. But we also have companies on the opposite side that say, I would rather give Maggie 24 hours to reject this request. Otherwise, the ticket will get automatically booked because we are more concerned with the flights fluctuating and getting raised up higher if we have to rebook it at a later date. You'll have reports such as this one to help you keep track of your violators. Of course, in a manual-based process, it's very difficult in that you might have an inkling that Michael tends to book out of policy, but you really don't know just how much that's costing your company. Over to the right, we can see each individual instance of violation so we know what people's various excuses have been. Brad will be happy to know that he can still earn frequent flyer miles. He doesn't lose that even though he's in a corporate booking tool. He can still choose his specific seat. And then here we have our selected method of payment. From there, the system's going to automatically reserve our car based off of our search criteria so that the very next screen that we have interaction with is our hotel selection. It's based off of a point that we plugged in to the search. It doesn't have to necessarily be just around the airport. We could plug in something like Los Angeles Convention Center, and the SAP Concur software will look up to identify that specific address and then base your search around that. If we scroll down to the bottom, we can see the hotels that are e-receipt enabled. We talked about that a little bit at the top of this module. And it's important to note that the hotel e-receipts have a little added nugget of technology where SAP Concur is also able to auto-itemize each line item on that hotel folio within Brad's expense report. So you can see to the left, each individual day's room rate as well as all the taxes have already been separated out for Brad. So now with our hotel selection, again, varying degrees of compliance, it lets us know which ones have prepayment required. And then Brad can put in preferences like close to the elevator or not by the ice machine, his hotel loyalty program where he can still earn points as well. And then after a couple of confirmation screens, Brad's all set to purchase his ticket. And he has the peace of mind that everything that he's done does in fact comply with his company's travel policy. Brad can also do this from the convenience of his SAP Concur mobile app. And he can see here that he still is going to have visual cues to direct him to making responsible decisions. Also included with your travel experience is our TripIt app. Some of you may be using the free version of this app, and at its core, it's an itinerary organizer designed to consolidate all of your reservations, even beyond your travel arrangements, things like restaurant reservations or events that you might have confirmations for. It gives it your one-stop shop, and all your confirmation numbers are going to be stored here. It also gives you directions within various airports to get to your connecting gate, especially in handy when you're making those layovers at an unfamiliar location. By collecting all of this itinerary information, we've formed what we call TripIt for Teams. It's a manager view that allows you to know where your employees are at a given period of time based off of their itinerary data. Of course, in a national or international crisis, you need to know where your employees are and if they're safe, and if not, how are you going to assist them in getting to a safe location. This would be what we refer to as duty of care light, because based off the itinerary information, you know which employees are potentially affected. For those of you who place a greater importance on duty of care, we have an upgraded module that we call SAP Concur Locate and Active Monitoring, where in addition to itinerary data, you can see on the map, we're taking account of office locations, home addresses. We also identify potential threat levels of various countries. You're also going to be able to give your employees the capability to do live check-ins to give a greater pinpoint on their location. And we can even make use of some corporate card data as well to, again, assist in giving a more accurate location for your employees. In the event of a crisis, we can facilitate a two-way communication with your employee. This is a service that can be done by your administrative staff within your company, but it's also a service that we offer. It comes in especially handy for those of you out there who have employees traveling all around the world, and of course you can't stay awake 24/7. Something might be happening on the other side of the planet while we're sleeping here in the US. And then you can see here just who has responded with OK and who is needing assistance. Here's an example of that communication that goes between the employee and SAP Concur or one of your admins, checking in with the employee to make sure that they're okay, and the employee in this case is requesting help. Confirmation that we received your request. Please leave your phone on so we can communicate with you, and your corporate security team has been notified. Expect a call very soon. This feature also works for cheerier scenarios, such as if you've negotiated free Wi-Fi and free breakfast at a hotel. Just by your employee being in proximity of that hotel, they will automatically receive a text to remind them to make sure that the hotel is giving them those perks. And so that concludes the travel booking tool. We looked at it from Brad's perspective and booked the flight, car, and hotel. We talked about those e-receipts for his convenience. And then lastly, we touched on duty of care. All of this will give Brad a lot of freedom to book flights that best fit with his schedule to make his meetings while ensuring that he remains compliant with his company's policies. All right, so let's move onward to the expense side of things. Now we're going to look at it from all three roles, starting first with Brad to capture his receipts on the go. We'll then create an expense report. From there, we will hand this over to Maggie. We'll talk about the expense report approval workflow. We'll also show you what it would look like for her to utilize visual icons to make quicker approvals. We'll then take a look at this from the AP and admin side, discussing visibility to all of your expense reports through the processor role, as well as how we can reimburse your employees and pay off your corporate credit cards. Now, Brad can utilize his SAP Concur mobile app to snap a photo. Because we also have a human component that does spot checks, I can confidently take a picture of a restaurant's itemized receipt in the same shot that I put the total, including the tip amounts, and have the confidence that the software is going to read this accurately and it'll produce the appropriate expense. So here within my queue of expenses, you can see a combination of ones that are out of pocket as well as matched up to business cards or corporate cards. Typically, those corporate and business card transactions go into our system about 48 hours after swipe because we're just waiting for the merchant to, of course, close out their batches and the clearinghouse and credit card companies to finalize that transaction. But within your SAP Concur account, you can hover over that green icon to see your credit card transaction details. You can hover over this blue icon to see the receipt image. Now, that image will stay tied to your SAP Concur account for a minimum of 7 years. To keep you compliant with the IRS auditing standards. That being said, while we've been around since 1993, we've been a cloud-based company for about 14 years, and we have not purged any images within our system. For those of you who are using Amex corporate cards, specifically, you have a little added nugget of technology where your travelers are able to separate transactions by statement date, thereby making month-end close easier for you in financing, because Brad won't accidentally add on a transaction from the next month's statement onto this month's expense report. Regardless of which corporate card company you use, not limited to Amex, but Visa, MasterCard, all the other major carriers, you will have reports such as this one, which will help you identify which transactions have yet to be submitted. Of course, this is much simpler than a manual process where you look at your credit card statement online and then have to walk up to every employee to double check that they've submitted their expenses. Instead, we know specifically which employees are in question and which transactions we need to be focused on. So now Brad can create his expense report. Of course, he can do it starting from scratch, or he can get a jump start of things with selecting a trip that he just booked. So under this scenario, the system will automatically pull in his flight, car, and hotel expenses. It will also look for transactions that were incurred over the same period of time. Here we can see samples of those e-receipts we spoke to earlier, first with Delta, and then here with the Hertz rental car. In the yellow box, we can see additional charges, things that we wouldn't necessarily have visibility to in a manual process because Brad might just be giving us the signed copy with the total. Now we can see things like Brad didn't fill the car up with gas prior to dropping it off, or he rented a GPS unit, which he shouldn't because we're already reimbursing him for a cell phone bill, which has GPS built into it. We talked about the hotel e-receipts having those auto itemizations, and that of course just makes it simpler to spot things that are potentially out of policy, things like a minibar or a movie rental. You could program our system to automatically mark those as a personal expense, do not reimburse me, which would then change the total amounts in the blue box of the expense report versus how much Brad wants to have reimbursed to him or paid off on his corporate card. So now let's address your policy violations. In this scenario, our business meal is getting flagged that it requires a business purpose. During implementation, you can decide how strict or how loose you want your rules to be, which fields are going to be required for specific individuals, such as maybe marketing. We always need to have a campaign with every single expense they put in. Meanwhile, somebody in HR or IT, we don't even want them to see that campaign field because we don't want them to get confused and give us bad data. You can also set limits on how much your employees are allowed to spend, whether it's in line with GSA per diem rates or perhaps custom rates for your company. You can make soft stops where there's simply a warning to the employee and a hard stop where it's so drastically out of policy, the employee must itemize it and mark part of it as personal before they're able to submit their expense report for approval. So here with this transaction, we'll type in our business purpose. We can mark transactions as billable or not billable. And then we can select, categorize our expenses through the use of drop-downs and blank spaces. These drop-downs could be synced up with your cost object list from your Dynamics software. And that's something that can be brought over via the Turnkey integration. Next up, we're going to allocate our expenses, and we can split those across multiple departments or projects or any other custom field that would be most relevant for your company. Brad can choose from a list of favorites that he might have had saved. He can also add them in from scratch, as well as allocate by specific percentage or dollar amounts. You can see over to the right-hand side, the code is the GL codes to go along with each one of those selections. And that's what's going to ensure proper mapping into your ERP system once the expense report has been fully approved within SAP Concur. Next up, Brad's going to add on some attendees. He can do so through multiple avenues, either forward on an Outlook calendar invite. He can also pull from a list of favorites, maybe set up favorite groups, or even just add them in one by one. And so with all of those set, we have now eliminated our exceptions on this report, and we can move forward with adding more transactions. Of course, all that data that we're looking to track, we want to be able to report on it. I mentioned this earlier at the top of the call, that now you're able to gain insight to your spend as soon as that's incurred and added to the expense report, rather than having to wait for month end for AP to be producing reports out of your ERP system. So now Brad's going to import some additional transactions that he's incurred. You can see here a mix of out-of-pocket expenses as well as corporate card transactions. Any comments that Brad has captured at the time that he snaps his photo can get translated over to the expense report automatically, thereby giving you better data because he's capturing it in the moment rather than trying to remember at the end of the month. The next report is here with expense accruals. So especially for Anna over in AP, being able to see what's out there in unapproved expense reports, having a better grasp on your company's cash flow to know how they're going to handle paying off bills or even report for profits. The most embellished expense type is bar none personal car mileage, because it's very difficult to hold your employees accountable to this number. I'm sure that there's not very many of you who actually walk out to your employee's car to see what their odometer readings are before and after their shifts. So we have two ways to go about that. The first is to utilize GPS tracking built right into the SAP Concur mobile app, where either Brad can manually start and stop his capture. He can also set time parameters that maybe whenever between the hours of 10 and 5, he's always driving on behalf of work. If he kept his app open, which he does not need to, he could see live updating numbers of the mileage that he's driven. And then once he completes his trip, he'll have an image that will suffice as your receipt that will track his exact route. The other option is to utilize our integration with Google Maps, where Brad will plug in his to and from addresses, and the system will calculate out the route with Google Maps. And again, we have the image map image to suffice as the receipt. For those of you who would like to deduct commute from what you would reimburse your employee, because I don't want to pay them for what they would have driven to get to the office anyways, a simple click of the button in that checkbox will include the employee's home addresses and office addresses, thereby changing the total amount that Brad gets reimbursed. So in this case, only 29 miles was in excess of his daily commute, and that would get reimbursed $15.66. That rate is based off of any number that your company chooses. And with that, we're ready to submit our expense report for approval. Your approval workflow can be as simple or as complex as you need it to be. Maybe our expense filer is one of the higher ups or an executive. Doesn't necessarily need manager approval. We just need it to get to AP so they can double check the coding and finalize everything before putting it into our ERP system. More commonly, however, we might see a direct manager like Maggie come into play before AP gets involved. We can also build in complexities such as perhaps an expense to get split across multiple departments. We, of course, then want to get those relevant department managers involved. The system will automatically do that. Brad does not need to indicate who he needs to have approve his expense report. And then, of course, we can incorporate dollar threshold approvals as well, as indicated by our department director up there at the top, and then our CFO down at the bottom. Meanwhile, our accounting manager and controller, even if they're not specifically approving any expense reports themselves, they'll have the reports, as we've shown you, to help keep track of their spend. They'll also have a real-time updating dashboard for all the expense reports that have been submitted, so they know exactly who they're with. We do offer an optional audit service. Now, this comes in handy because we understand your staff has better things to do than to look at every single line item just to validate that the receipt image that they've attached does in fact match up to the expense that they filled out and what they're hoping to get reimbursed or paid off on their corporate card. So under this scenario, we would bear that burden and double check that the receipts are in fact correct to the expense line items. We could also check for things like policy, things that software just can't catch, like perhaps making sure that the number of attendees is equal to the number of entrees that are on the receipt. Of course, you can't get software to do that. You would need a human eye to physically look at the receipt and compare those numbers of entrees versus the number of attendees. So now Maggie will get an email notification letting her know that she has expense reports pending her approval. And since Brad's was fully compliant, we'll look at somebody else's. We're taking a look at George's here. Maggie can do this either on the web interfaces we're about to show you or on her SAP Concur mobile app. Right away, Maggie is able to see all of the exceptions. So these are the soft stops that were just warnings to George, but he elected to still submit his expense report anyways. So of course we want Maggie to look at all the line items, but she knows that these are the three that she needs to pay particular attention to. She can, of course, hover over this icon to see the receipt image. She can then take a look at the credit card transaction details and then the comment that George left behind as to justification as why he felt he was justified in slightly breaking policy. Here with the Best Buy transaction, we can also see the comments that George left behind. And then here with the entertainment, we can see attendees at a glance. And $83 a head is much more reasonable, but it's still relatively high. So Maggie's going to want to double check more details of the transaction. She can see that the client signed new contracts at dinner, and they were meeting with the client about the park project. But if we look over to the left-hand side, we can see that that yellow icon lets Maggie know that George in this scenario did not attach a receipt for this particular transaction. Maggie now has two options. She can either send back the entire expense report, or she can choose to send back just this one individual transaction and approve the rest of the expense report. So now when she clicks approve, she'll be prompted to provide an explanation as to why she's sending that expense back, and the rest of the expense report moves forward to the next step in the approval workflow. On that note of workflow, I do want to point out that what you saw in that screenshot is not the full extent of our customizations. It's just the slides are only so big. So if you do have something that's even more complex, please reach out to us and we would be happy to show you how we can handle that process. Maggie will have access to a dashboard which will combine multiple reports into a single view, making it easy for her to identify trends in her spending. Things like her top 10 spending employees. She can also track budget quarter over quarter. She can also use this dashboard as a launching platform to help her get to other relevant reports. She'll be able to see her top policy violators, and because all of these names are hyperlinked, a simple click of the button on Kevin's name will allow us to see those 264 exceptions that he's racked up. Now you'll have reports like this to help you keep track of manager approval times. Of course, we want the number of days that it takes for them to approve expense reports to decrease, but equally important are the number of exceptions that they're approving. So we're going to definitely want to have a conversation with Michael. One, what's taking you so long? And two, why are you okaying so many policy violations? Why are you not sending them back to their employees to have them adjusted accordingly so that they're not violating policy? This processor role is where Anna's going to live in every day. It's something that her AP manager and controller might peek into from time to time. It's no longer a guessing game of who's got an expense report because that orange box lets us know exactly where an expense report is sitting. You can use a basic search tool to also look up expense reports by employee name, report name, approval status, payment status, and many others. You can also build your own custom queries. So perhaps you want to look at all of the expense reports related to a particular location or department or project. You can also perhaps identify all the expenses related to a certain particular expense type. Once the expense reports get fully approved, we can facilitate the payment for you. A ACH transfer that would move from your company's checking account over to your employee's checking account, and that'll take 3 days. This is an option that we offer both here in the US as well as a few dozen countries internationally as well. And so that concludes the expense side of things. We looked at it again from all 3 different roles. We started with Brad to capture receipts on the go, build an expense report, add details to the expense report. We then showed you Maggie and the approval workflow options. We talked about the visual icons that she can quickly identify why her employees think that they're justified in breaking policy. And then we talked about the AP role and the visibility through the expense report processor role. All of this will give you expense reports that practically write themselves, even police themselves. So of course, we want to make sure that we can seamlessly integrate this with your ERP system. Turnkey does have a, it's an expense connection that we can move your approved expense report data from SAP Concur over into GP, and then of course all your GL codes for your cost objects like class, department, project, customer, up into SAP Concur for your employees to categorize your expenses. We also wanted to show you a couple more dashboards. This is for the executives in the room, being able to track your top 10 slowest approvers, your top 10 slowest submitters, also graphical representations of your largest expense type spends. You can see here things like who's spending more money on cash versus on a corporate card. And to the right, we can see our most expensive expense types and our top suppliers. Maybe leverage some of that data to negotiate better rates. You also have the ability to build custom reports in SAP Concur. This is something that you can do yourselves or we can do on your behalf. Here we're combining travel and expense data with invoice data and have it broken down by department. The last thing I want to say around reporting is that we can email reports out automatically to relevant people. So perhaps reports 1, 2, and 3 need to go to our controller, CFO, and AP manager, and reports 4, 5, and 6 need to go to everybody else. And you can choose the cadence that you would like to have set, either every single day, maybe every Monday morning, once a month. It does not have to be an all or nothing thing. You can be specific to each report. And so with that, we hope that you have the confidence that through SAP Concur's platform, you'll have total spend visibility. And because of the cloud-to-cloud integration with Turnkey, you'll also have seamless integration to move this data into your ERP system, Dynamics GP. So that concludes the demo portion. And just to quickly recap, we talked about the travel booking tool, giving Brad a lot of freedom while making sure that he stays compliant with company's policies. And then the expense report side of things, reports that practically write themselves, as well as police themselves, and taking away that awkward conversation of you having to be the bad guy and rejecting expense reports. The reviews speak for themselves. We pride ourselves on our customer satisfaction, and if you were to go to the iTunes App Center, you'd see that we have well over 300,000 reviews to the tune of a 4.7 star rating. Here's some of the quotes that I pulled out, like at the top right. I'm so picky that I've never rated anything 5 stars, but this app deserves it. There's also a quote from September that I pulled out because I'm trying to keep this as current as possible. But in September, if you were to look it up, the person said that they typically have a phobia of technology, but that's no longer the case thanks to the SAP Concur mobile app. So I would like to thank everybody for their time today, as well as Turnkey for giving us the opportunity to present. And I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has them.
Hey, Nick, thank you so much for presenting. Really appreciate it. It was a lot of great info there. We did get a couple questions. For one, what does an implementation look like with SAP Concur?
Sure. So under that scenario, you would be assigned an implementation coach. So what they'll do is it's task-based. So they'll have an introduction call, prep you for the scenario, and then they'll have a call with you to sort of give you some tasks to do, like develop your list of expense types, how you're going to categorize your expenses. Think about the cost objects that you want to integrate. Think about how much you want to have your dollar thresholds for your policy. And so they'll walk you through that process and then check in at a time that you schedule to double check your work and make sure that everything's good to go before moving on to the next step. So typically this process will take about 4 weeks, depending on how simple or complex your policies are.
Okay. And then how do companies typically roll this out to their users?
Sure. So for that, during implementation, we make sure that your admins are completely fluent in SAP Concur, but we don't directly offer training for the end users. Now that being said, we do have a wide range of videos for your employees to watch. We also conduct weekly webinars, very similar to this one. And that's something that your employees are more than welcome to attend for free, and they'd be able to watch and learn how the software works. They can also use that platform or that forum to ask questions. And so through that, they could get well trained up on the software and be fluent themselves.
Okay. And then can you reimburse employees internationally?
Yes, you can. So that would be through ACH transfers. We have the ability to do that throughout pretty much all of the countries in Europe, as well as countries in parts of Asia, as well as Australia, and then of course North America here with Canada and Mexico.
Okay, and then finally, last question here is, how do you handle value-added tax?
Sure. So that's something that we can build into your account, so that way it's automatically calculated out on behalf of your employees. For countries like Canada, where you have provincial tax instead of just a general VAT tax for the entire country, we can absolutely take that into account. And we would give you reports to make it easy for you to file your VAT reclamation at the end of the year. We also have a lot of partners out there who have the ability to reclaim tax on your behalf. So that's just one less thing that you'd have to worry about. What's nice is that they don't charge an upfront fee, but rather just take a small percentage off the top of the amount that they're reclaiming for you. So really, if you have a lot of international travelers, that just takes everything off of your plate, and you just see checks roll in every month.
Okay. Well, I think that just about wraps up the webinar. Nick, thank you so much again for presenting with us today, and thank you, SAP Concur. And for everybody who joined us, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. And if you have questions, we are going to be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow. It'll have contact information as well as a link where you can find this recorded video. So until next time, you guys have our information, and you can also contact us through our website. And I hope everybody has a great day.